afternoon, everyone. I'm Fabienne Hara. I'm the Deputy Director of the Paris Peace Forum, and I want to say hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for participating in this session, this high-level roundtable that we titled Emerging Threats and Cutting-Edge Risks, a Turning Point for Peace and Security in Cyberspace, ? So today we are gathered here because we need to address this very timely and relevant topic. We've seen two trends combined in recent times: the acceleration of technological development, including AI, quantum technologies, and so on, but also an increasingly tense geopolitical situation. And all of this is not just theoretical. We've seen examples of high-intensity conflicts, for example, in Ukraine, where there's been disruption of critical infrastructures, cutting off telecommunications, which had, of course, disastrous consequences on people's life. And we've also seen an increasing number of cyber attacks, which status is a little bit undefined. We don't know whether we can call them acts of war or not. It's unclear, but they also have major consequences on populations. So today, we as the Paris Peace Forum have the pleasure of convening this very interesting high-level roundtable because, as you may know, we are joined by extremely distinguished participants, which I will introduce right now. First, the Prime Minister of Albania, Edi Rama. Mr. Brad Smith, CEO and Vice Chair of Microsoft, and Mr. Craig Jones, who stands for Jürgen Stock from Interpol, Mr. Maher Bitar, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Intelligence Programs at the National Security Council at the White House, Mr. Brett Solomon, Executive Director of Access Now, and Anne-Marie Bouzatou, Executive Director of ICT for Peace. We will have a little less than an hour for discussion, about 50 minutes, and we will have 2 rounds of discussions with a little time for Q&As in between. So first, let me turn to the Prime Minister of Albania. So Prime Minister, Albania has had a cyber crisis recently, so could you explain to us what happened? And what is the impact of geopolitics on this crisis?
Thank you very much. I can tell you shortly, and in general, it's not a good idea to invite someone from the Balkans and ask him to speak shortly, but I'll do my best. We have had a very big change in Albania by practically transposing more than 1,000 services to online and cutting big time the interaction between people and the institutions by offering to the people a very fast way to get their services, and in the same time exposing ourselves to potential threats and attacks. The fact is that we were attacked very heavily by Iran due to the presence in Albania of more than 3,000 Iranian opposition people, and we risk to lose completely all the system we have built. And thanks to Microsoft, cheers. And in Albania, when someone does this, we say, I'm saying the truth. So thanks to Microsoft, first and foremost, that helped us in real time, we succeeded to save all the infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and we are now working to make it more resilient. But in the meantime, what we learned in this process is that Europe as such, and starting from the European Union, should think very seriously in creating a common system of cyber defense, because so far the systems are very separated from each other, and so are more vulnerable on one hand. On the other hand, having a common system of defense, then for sure whomever would try to make harm to one country or the other has to break in a system that is not of one country but of an assembly of countries. And also, there are people here that are much more competent than me in this, but what we learned is also that it can be even financially much more feasible in many ways, and also in terms of predictability, it can be much more feasible because it's a real war that happens in the space, and there are real tools like air fighters or like other machines of war, but that are in the space. And it's very important, the knowledge of what enemies use. And to have a common knowledge on this is much more healthy than to have separate knowledge. And by following the attacks of one country on another country, you learn a lot on how to deal and what to expect if the attacks with the same tools will come towards you. So this is what I can say, just to be short. And again, I want to express thanks. I hadn't the chance before to Microsoft, because you know, when you see these big companies, and I'm talking about Microsoft from afar, you tend to think that they are ruthless sharks that are there to suck the blood of everyone and to make of everyone a robot. And so I was so impressed, so impressed by their ethics and by their commitments. It was incredible, because it was really like a trench. It was not a trench with guns and with soldiers that were shooting and being shot, but was a trench in a large room like this with tables and computers, and their people taught to our people that sleeping in these times of war was not a good idea. So you would imagine that if they would come, they would give you some advice, then they would go to a hotel to have the meal and to sleep. No, they were there around the clock, and it was also a great lesson, and which is still today remembered by the people that worked with them. So that's why I'm thanking and expressing my gratitude to you. So sorry for that.
Thank you very much. This is fascinating, and I would love to ask you a million questions more. But you mentioned the support Microsoft gave Albania, so I'm turning to you, Mr. Brad Smith, now. How do you assess these risks, this situation we've just talked about? How do you measure, how do you assess the threats? I know you publish the digital defense reports, which are now must-reads But please enlighten us about the impact of these technologies and the threat assessment methodology you use.
Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you. I think broadly speaking in the world today, we are seeing two particular trends when it comes to the threats that we're facing. And the first, I think, is actually captured very well in what happened in Albania last year. And what the people of Albania were subjected to, namely an aggressive, malicious, destructive cyber attack. And what we're seeing in the world today is, thankfully, a small number of countries, but a critically well-resourced number of countries, in, frankly, Iran and in Russia and in China and in North Korea, at times acting both with greater sophistication and more aggressiveness. And I think that should be a cause for concern. And one of the things that I think should concern us as well is that we're not necessarily seeing governments that are engaged in more and more sophisticated activity recognizing or respecting the fundamental norms that were established in the 20th century. The norm that would say, protect civilians. The norm that would say, don't try to impair civilian infrastructure. And I think one of the most important and disconcerting things we're seeing is this kind of focus in a situation like what we heard about in Albania, or more broadly, really targeting critical infrastructure like the water system or the electrical grid or the air traffic control system, and not necessarily for what governments have traditionally done, namely engage in espionage, but rather to create the kinds of vulnerabilities that could put a large civilian population at very fundamental risk in the event of a future crisis or conflict. And that is something that I think the whole world should pay attention to and stand against. A related trend that we're seeing is something that is reflected in the world of technology development all the time. The question always when you want to create something new is to build it or buy it, build or buy. Well, the truth is if you want to build something, you have to have your own team of talented developers. And there are a small number of countries in the world that have that capability. To buy something, you just need to have money. And the reality is there are more countries with money than their own build capability for cyber activities. And that's where we're seeing this ecosystem evolve in a way that adds to the threats the world is facing. In terms of the rise of these private sector offensive actors, or really what they are, cyber mercenaries. That's one part of the threat landscape. The other trend, I would say, is a growing sophistication, even amid market consolidation, is the way to think about it, for cyber criminal activity. At Microsoft, we're tracking 123 criminal syndicates. They basically offer ransomware as a service. They probably now account for something on the order of 40% or more of all cyber criminal activity. And this is not an unusual phenomenon. If you think about any market in the history of economics, over time, those that are more sophisticated end up with more market share than those who are not. But what they're doing is then increasingly targeting their activity at those organizations that have weaker defenses. After all, they're in the business of trying to make money. They are diversifying the way they are making money. It used to be that they would plant ransomware that would lock a computer, and then they would say, you'll only get your control of your computer back if you'll pay us. But in 13% of the incidents we've seen during the last year, they also exfiltrated data. So what they in effect said was, you need to pay us to get back control of your computer, and you need to pay us if you're ever going to get your data back as well. That's disconcerting. More and more, they're focused on smaller and medium-sized enterprises or public sector organizations that have weaker defenses, smaller budgets. And then the one last thing I would call out is they, too, have learned the lesson of Ukraine. The defense of Ukraine in so many ways depended, when it comes to cyberspace, on the combination of better threat intelligence and detection capability and what's called endpoint protection, managed devices. It means that people who work for an organization have security protection on their device, even if it's something they brought themselves. It's something that we and other companies offer so that we can constantly provide security on a real-time updated basis, so that if there's a new attack, we can download the means to protect against it. More and more, we're seeing the successful ransomware attacks enter smaller organizations through unmanaged and unprotected devices. So what that tells us is we need to keep learning from each year and I'll say spread the best practices in cybersecurity protection more broadly so that those who are more vulnerable are better protected.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating and a little bit terrifying too. You talked about violations of international law and by states in particular. So Mr. Solomon, could you tell us a bit about the impact of these attacks on human security in particular?
Thank you so much. My name is Brett Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of Access Now, and I am a representative of civil society, so it's great to be here with Prime Ministers and presidents of companies. I think, we've come to the conclusion that cyberspace itself is a threat to peace and security. And it is in such a way that's left us vulnerable and defenceless and at risk. And we can see that even governments themselves can't protect them in situations when those attacks are coming. I'm really pleased for us to be part of the Paris call. And I was looking at it again in preparation for today, and I looked at the first principle, which basically says that signatories must prevent malicious activities that harm individuals and critical infrastructure. So it's 81 countries that have signed up to that and 706 companies. And unfortunately, as we've heard from the Prime Minister, it's actually the states and sometimes the companies themselves that are not only not preventing those malicious attacks, but are actually the cause of them. So I want to run through a couple of things that we're seeing in civil society from cyberspace that are impacting and threatening peace and security, because actually, I think as Brad kind of indicated, we're experiencing a fully fledged crisis right now. And most of your citizens and your customers are caught in the crossfire. And that means that there's a huge amount of responsibility and a gap in terms of response. And the first one, it relates to internet shutdowns. Access Now is the lead agency tracking internet shutdowns with a coalition of 300 NGOs. And there are 187 internet shutdowns last year in 34 countries. And I just spoke to my colleague who's tracking them hourly, daily, and it looks like we will exceed that this year. What shutdowns do, and they're willful, intentional shutdowns, is they cause significant pandemonium amongst citizens, and yet shutdowns now have become a weapon of war. Because of the 187 internet shutdowns that we tracked last year, 133 of them are connected with violence and conflict. And that means that countries intentionally are shutting down the internet at the same time as they're involved in conflict, and as a shroud to prevent visibility into other human rights abuses. So the shutdown happens just before the bombardment happens, and we're seeing that in Gaza as we speak. There's been 3 waves of internet shutdowns. Brad, you mentioned Ukraine. There's 33 internet shutdowns since Russia invaded and occupied Ukraine. So that's the first item, and I just want people to imagine what it would be like if the bombs are dropping and the internet is shut off. What that means in terms of being able to reach your loved ones, identify and connect with emergency services, find out where humanitarian corridors are. This is exactly the experience that's happening right now. The second issue I wanted to mention is spyware. We had a very good meeting yesterday to look at the proliferation of commercial spyware, and I would say this is similar to the idea of cyber mercenaries as well. One of the things that's a very positive development, I think, in a dark kind of horizon, is that we've identified that spyware is not only a threat to human rights, it's also a threat to security, and that was identified by the US government, which is a big development. We used to be thought that surveillance was the pathway to security. Now we're seeing it as a threat. And I will say that it's not just human rights defenders and journalists and activists who are at risk here. It's also prime ministers and presidents. And even the president, I should say, of France, was a subject of Pegasus on his device. That's why we at Access Now has called for a moratorium on spyware. That is the mic drop over there. So a moratorium on spyware, and also a ban on certain spyware capabilities, including Pegasus. I want to thank the companies that are taking action on this, including Apple, by alerting people to when there's been incidents of state-sponsored attacks. And the third issue that I talk about real briefly is AI and AI-generated attacks in the context of peace and security. So we're seeing facial recognition being used in warfare. We're seeing synthetic media as an incitement to genocide. And of course, AI cyber-empowered attacks that iterate and reform and write themselves as the target changes. So it's why we need urgent regulations, institutions, laws, norms, and accountability mechanisms on AI. Because when we think about AI in peacetime and AI in wartime, is a very different area of responsibility. And lastly, before I hand over, I just wanted to say, in the context of shutdowns and spyware and AI, Access Now and 80 other organisations have called for a digital ceasefire in the context of the war in Gaza. Stopping the internet shutdowns, protecting accounts and the data of users from platforms, stopping the state sponsoring of propaganda, and fully investigating cyber attacks as they happen. These are issues of today. They're not issues of tomorrow, and I urge us to take action when we think about the topic of this panel, before we go beyond the point of no return. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Really interesting ideas and proposals. Let us pause here for a few minutes in case there are reactions or comments from the room or questions to the panelists. Any questions? Okay. What I found really fascinating in all the three interventions was the fact that there were actually proposals for constructive use of these technologies. So perhaps if one of you would like to elaborate more concretely on that, would be tremendous.
Well, I think we have two very important opportunities to, I'll say, move the edge of the envelope in terms of use of technology to defend and protect and help organizations recover when there are these kinds of attacks. The first is the use of AI itself. And I think that's important because the conversation about AI and cybersecurity almost naturally tends to take people oftentimes to worry first about what can go wrong, when in fact we should also devote certainly at least equal attention to how to use AI to make things go right. And I think that one of the things to recognize is that one of the great strengths of artificial intelligence is its ability to detect patterns amidst a sea of data. So that, in fact, is what we're focused on doing. And there's no sea of data in the world today that is perhaps as large as the sea of data that is just coming across the internet At Microsoft, we get 65 trillion signals a day coming back to our data centers from various services and devices. So that AI is a fundamental new tool to help us identify more quickly the kinds of threats that we're facing. And I think threat intelligence is the ultimate cornerstone for almost all defensive activity. Second, I think we have an enormous opportunity to use AI to then disrupt and defeat these threats. In some cases, we can use AI to launch countermeasures faster than humans would be able to move. But there's another very important opportunity to put generative AI to work. If you actually look around the world today, arguably the biggest weakness that every country faces is a shortage of people doing cybersecurity work, a shortage of people trained to do cybersecurity work. So we're now finding with generative AI that we can build new security services that help people improve their productivity and also lower the barriers to entry for cybersecurity work. So I think that is an extraordinarily important thing. The second thing that we've certainly concluded at Microsoft is that 2023 has brought another year, as one sees periodically, where we need to step back and focus on fundamental changes and advances in the way we engineer software and services. So that's what we launched 2 weeks ago through what we call our Secure Future initiative, that fundamentally includes an engineering initiative aimed at writing code in new ways, taking the secure development language that was first developed at Microsoft in 2004 and taking it into a new era with more dynamic tools to constantly update the software we're developing to take account of the most recent, almost real-time changes in the threat landscape. We're talking about writing code in different ways. We're talking about spreading expertise across the industry, using what's called memory-safe computing, something that the CISA in the United States has called out, I think rightly so, as something that can make software more secure. We're also focused on new advances in what are called identity protection, the protection of people's identities so that they cannot be replicated or emulated or accounts can't be broken into, and really working to create a new standard for moving faster to address vulnerabilities when they're identified. So I do think it's worth just recalling that this is a technological challenge, and part of it, what it needs is a technological response.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is a perfect transition to the second part of our discussion, which will be more focused on governance frameworks. So Mr. Craig Jones from Interpol, you have the floor.
Thank you. Could I just pick up on a couple of the points there? So certainly from a global law enforcement perspective, police are drawn from the community to protect the community. We work very much in our local communities. What we found with the development of cybercrime is we don't have that knowledge and we don't have that information. So we need to draw it back to what is the role of law enforcement with this. It's to protect life and property and prevent crime. As Brad's comments just made there now, I think we're now starting to see that first point where technology through AI will be a real clear example around where we can do more protection and prevention, because we haven't been as coordinated or joined up as we have been across the globe in that piece. So when we look at the cyber criminals now, we look at the threat, we talk about them being more advanced, more sophisticated. We've seen the barriers being lowered because they have access to tools and capabilities, and we can talk about advanced persistent cybercrime, for example. But effectively, we're talking about crime, and we're talking about crime in that digital space. And the other point I just want to make is about some of the language here. We're talking about, security, technology. What we need to do is look at the safety aspect of this. So when we're explaining things, how is this going to make people safer? Or how's this going to make organisations safer when they're online effectively? The tools that they're using, it should be built in. Safety by design should be built in. And we saw the US release their cyber strategy this year, and there were two important shifts in that for me, where I saw for the first time. A country was talking about putting less onus on individuals or small companies around their safety online space, but also more around the software being more secure as well. So I think there is a shift going on in this space, but also there's a shift going on now where there's going to be more things available to, as Brad's point come back, with the data that's there, we're going to be able to do more in the AI space to help protect communities. So I just wanted to pick up on those points from that first session.
Thank you. I think this session will help us feed the discussion on responsible behavior, responsible use of AI. There's such a thing, I think, in the nuclear world as responsible behavior. Perhaps this is also a concept that we can apply to cyberspace. So, Mr. Maher Bitta, what is the US government doing to counter these risks and threats?
Thank you, and thanks everybody. So my role at the White House is to coordinate intelligence policy across US government departments and agencies. And we have undertaken an initiative over the last 2 years that I think represents a unique convergence between work being undertaken by industry, by civil society, and also by governments. And that has to do with the most sophisticated tools that are being sold in this marketplace, and it has to do with commercial spyware, which Brett touched on as well. This is something that for the US government, we, from the beginning, viewed as implicating for us national security and counterintelligence risks, as well as human rights concerns. There was a convergence of the two. And it is something that ultimately we have focused and made a priority for the US government. The President has spoken about this, our Secretaries of State of Homeland Security, our Director of National Intelligence, even our leadership at the Department of Justice have all spoken about this concern. And it is something that we have also put into the US national security strategy. We proceeded along a number of lines of effort to try to build, I think, the governance structure that is being discussed here that may serve as a model for broader efforts. The first was that we needed to make sure that the US government had its own house in order, that we had guardrails for the United States government. And that is work that we undertook for over a year to develop what was ultimately an executive order issued by the President regarding commercial spyware. It has created novel and new standards for the US government and an oversight infrastructure that did not exist previously. Secondly, is we explored whether there were regulatory authorities that we could use as the US government to address what has become the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware across the world. And here we used authorities that the United States government has, in particular the Department of Commerce entity list, to add particular vendors of concern to the entity list. We did so in November of 2021, and we did again place additional entities on the entity list in this summer of 2023. But we also wanted to expand the work that we were doing jointly with other governments. And we issued, at the end of March, as part of the Summit for Democracy that the President hosted, a joint diplomatic statement, the joint statement on on efforts to counter the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware. And joined by 10 other countries, and in close partnership with our colleagues from France and the United Kingdom, the joint statement sets out for the first time a joint vision on both the national security threats and risks, as well as the human rights risks and threats of the proliferation and misuse of commercial spyware, but also includes effectively a roadmap for action for governments to undertake. And part of that roadmap for action includes a call on governments to engage closely civil society and industry. So moving forward, we are looking to undertake a number of actions. We are exploring other regulatory steps that we might be able to undertake. We are seeking to expand our diplomacy, and we are grateful to be invited to the Paris Peace Forum We are also looking to work with our colleagues from the UK and France for additional engagements over the coming year, leading up to the next Summit for Democracy. And we're also looking at other creative areas where we can engage. One area is trying to ensure that investors in this space are acting responsibly, and also seeing if additional governments can leverage their own authorities in this space to help shape this marketplace and help us counter the proliferation and misuse. And the last thing I'll say, which I think is vital, this is not abstract to the US government. And one of the reasons is we have undertaken an intensive effort to understand the extent to which such spyware may have been used against our own personnel, and we have identified those cases. But secondly, we have also made a concerted effort to meet with those who've been affected by or been targeted by commercial spyware. And that has provided unique insight, but it has also reinforced how this is not an abstract issue. It truly does affect both the individuals who've been affected, but it has ripple effects across society. It has ripple effects that, that we as a government, and I think the global community, need to be conscious of. So I'll stop there, and I hope that serves as a basis for additional discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I like the concept of cyber diplomacy. But I think you pointed out very rightly that one of the issues is to make it more global, right? To build cooperation, to build alliances for responsible use of technologies. So Anne-Marie Busato, please, you have the floor. What's the roadmap to better cooperation?
Well, that's a big question. I was actually asked to focus more on how multi-stakeholder cooperation can improve governance frameworks. But I think that's going to weave in a lot of these topics that we've talked about today. And first of all, multi-stakeholderism is kind of a buzzword, something that you hear all the time. And I think what I'd like to do, though, is take a step back and look at basics, like what do we really mean by multi-stakeholderism, and why do we need it? And I've had several people come to me say, well, look, for a long time, we've had multinational actors that have operated across borders that have a lot of influence, and yet we haven't tried to fundamentally change our governance structures. Why are technologies different? So just to kind of maybe go back to some particular qualities of technologies that I think really show why we do need a multi-stakeholder collaboration. And then this also can help show what an effective multi-stakeholder collaboration might be. So a few things I want to point out. These technologies are inherently often non-local, or their impacts at a distance. And so actors, even individuals, not just organizations, can, with very low barriers of entry, can move at a speed and with an impact, not just across borders, but across continents, impacting people that are very far away from them and who are in governance systems that can't really touch that person or not easily, not with the way that our systems are set up. And then we have this kind of temporal disconnectivity. What I mean by that, it's kind of that the person doesn't have to be at the computer pushing the buttons, launching attack. These things can be in algorithms, programs that are looking for particular conditions or vulnerabilities and can attack when they find them. And then, especially now with AI, we're going to have more systems that are be able to take, change decisions as conditions change without even a human being behind it. And I think this really means that we have a shift in what we mean by effective control. So putting on my lawyer hat, international law is really something that is looking at a state having effective control over its territory. But if we look at the territory of cyberspace, what is that? And if we kind of call it some type of domain or territory, I know people push back on that and they say the servers are still based on the land, yes. But there is this space that we are interacting in where the infrastructure, the logical and physical infrastructure is largely owned and developed by private sector, certainly going across borders, and our governance and oversight systems are not really adapted to this new framework. So what does that mean? Well, I do think that we need meaningful participation of stakeholders, because each of us stakeholders, we have a different piece of that effective control pie. Governments, of course, they are regulators. They're also clients and users of these technologies. Then we have civil society. They're the ones that are really impacted by these. These are the ones that are often on the receiving end of these attacks, as well as states. And then, of course, we have the companies that are developing these technologies that are choosing the way that it's going with feedback. But each of us, different stakeholders, we have a part to play in how we can manage cyberspace. So if we're going to figure out how do we have the type of safe and secure cyberspace that we want, we really need to, first of all, speak together, come together and have some common standards, which are starting to be developed, and the Paris Call has them, but then figure out what is each of our roles to make those standards a reality. What does a government have to do to make that standard a reality? What does a company have to do to collaborate with the government? And I think this is, and there must be, when I say really meaningful, that means that even non-state actors, where they have areas where they really have the expertise or control, need to be able to influence decisions in a meaningful way. And that also goes to education of even us as civil users, because sometimes we users are the biggest vulnerabilities in the system. So I will stop there, but I do think that the Paris Peace Forum provides a really good bringing all these stakeholders together. And so if I would say one thing, I would like to see maybe how it could be more effective in coming up with some really effective, meaningful governance structures. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this really interesting discussion on governance. There is a demand for governance, clearly, in this room. So we have about 10 minutes for an interactive discussion. Does anyone have comments or questions? Please.
Thank you. Just building out from Anne-Marie's points there on governance, certainly as Interpol, we recognise we have an organisation that has governance within it. So we've laid out instruments within our own organisation to counter and combat cybercrime. And we've done it through prevention, detection, investigation and disruption. So under each of those areas, we have a global cybercrime programme which is looking to deliver outputs and outcomes that meet specific objectives. And it's about prevention in the first instance. So all 195 member countries of Interpol have signed up to a resolution on that. So we have that instrument within the organisation. And then to build on that, the United Nations and the new convention to negotiate an international convention to counter the use of information and communication technology for criminal purposes, otherwise known as the Cybercrime Convention. We're involved very heavily in that process, but we're making sure we do what we know. We're talking about law enforcement within that. So the 4 key areas we've suggested within that convention are firstly, prioritising cybercrime at a national basis within countries, but recognising it is to protect the communities that are governed by those countries. Secondly, it is about reducing the gaps in countries' capabilities and capacities. And there's a difference between a capability and a capacity, but we won't have time to go into that now. The third one is making sure public-private partnerships are involved in this, because it is private sector have that information effectively, and we need to work out how we can use that information effectively. But proportionality comes into this as well. So it's not about collecting huge data sets. It's about doing the work to identify either the criminals or infrastructure that are facilitating the cybercrime space. And again, we just work in the cybercrime space. So building out those different structures is really important. And just finally, I'll finish on the point that, we're happy to have signed the call now. So Interpol are now part of this forum process. So again, recognising the different forums out there where Interpol, as a global voice for law enforcement, is able to speak on behalf of law enforcement for law enforcement.
We're very pleased that you signed the call. Thank you. Any comments, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Tim Moore. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I first need to say that what I say now is going to be my personal view, having left the US government in May after 2.5 years. And during the discussion today, we've covered a fair amount of ground, from the attack against Albania, ransomware, commercial spyware. And I thought I'd share some observations from my time as the cybersecurity advisor to Secretary Mayorkas, the Secretary of Homeland Security in the US, and my time at the White House where I was working on democracy, technology, and human rights. And I'd like to pick up something that Brad said, which is the blurring of lines between the civilian, the political, and the military. Because I think that is a theme that actually connects the different topics that we've covered today. If we think of what happened in Albania, you can think of it through the lens of national security from the government's perspective of what it suffered, but it's also a case of transnational repression of a foreign actor that targeted a government and a community in a foreign country because it was providing refuge to a certain kind of people. If we talk about what Brad mentioned in terms of the ransomware attacks we've seen, I remember being at the Department of Homeland Security in early 2021, and the notion that criminals would target hospitals in the midst of a pandemic just seemed outrageous to me. And I do think if we look at the international discussion around rules of the road, this deterioration of norms that we see with respect to Ukraine, but also with respect to the targeting of water facilities and others, is something that we've witnessed now for a few years, and it's not clear to me how we are going to capture that as an international community to avoid a further erosion. Which leads me to my the commercial spyware one, where we see similar erosion of norms that we are now in an environment where journalists, dissidents get targeted in other countries, and their sovereignty, whether it's an interference or not, I leave to the lawyers. But I do think that is something that we are seeing across the board in the topics we've seen, and it's the nexus between national security, human rights, and cybersecurity. And since Microsoft has put out the Digital Geneva Convention several years ago, we live in a slightly different world now with what happened in Ukraine. But I do wonder, where do we go from here? The Red Cross had an interesting recent announcement trying to encourage hacktivist groups to sign on to some of the existing principles. So I do wonder what people in the room think other ways may be for being more creative in this space. Because with all the attention on AI right now, I do think that on the cybersecurity side, there remains a significant risk, and we can't stop being creative on this area as well. Thank you.
I think you just said a number of important things, and thank you. And I might say, I think the most important thing you said was when you posed the question, where do we go from here? Because I do think that's an important question for all of us in this meeting to ask ourselves and to talk about with each other in the weeks and months to follow. I do think it's worth just reflecting on the fact that the first Paris Peace Forum and the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace came together 5 years ago. So this is the 5th anniversary of both. And I think it's worth reflecting on the advances that we've achieved in the past 5 years. From my vantage point, there's probably a few things that stand out as especially important. The first is the text of the Paris Call itself, which I think did two things. First, it reaffirmed and reinforced key international norms. And second, it complemented the existing norms, especially through the principle number 3 around the protection of elections, a principle that I think has become even more important in the years since. Second, it really did blaze new territory by bringing together so many organizations on a multi-stakeholder basis, governments, civil society, businesses, tech companies. And third, it created a foundation for what was pursued, namely practical action through the Paris Call communities that in some very important cases were co-chaired by governments, companies, and civil society organizations together that helped develop and disseminate best practices. So I think all of that reflects a very important contribution. But as with all such things, it only continues to get better if we put renewed energy into it. And I think that this conversation highlights at one level the changes in the threat landscape. But I think what that should do, what I hope it would do, is also inspire us to raise our ambition level for what we can accomplish in the next 5 years. And I certainly would say there is a lot of opportunity for us to do more together. I think we need to do more to make sure that the world understands that there are certain red lines that no government should cross. I think there needs to be more work to reinforce those lines, especially around the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. And I think there needs to be more work done to hold governments who cross those lines to account. And certainly one form of accountability is public attribution on a multi-stakeholder and multilateral basis. Interestingly, perhaps almost ironically, if you go back to 2018, almost the only public attributions were made by a single government, a couple governments acting together. The tech sector hadn't yet found its voice. But in the wake of the NotPetya attack and then the WannaCry attack and then the NotPetya attack, both of which preceded the Paris call, governments started to come together. The tech sector has found its voice, but I don't think we're using our voice. I don't think governments are using their voice. I don't think companies are using their voice in a collective multi-stakeholder form that frankly would put more pressure on people to stop violating these norms. And I think if we were to couple that with a new wave of practical action that would take concrete steps together that share best practices, I think we could reinforce that effort. So I just think in sum, this is not the time to look back and say this was a good endeavor. It's the time to say it is and needs to continue to be a critical endeavor for the future. But that's only going to come if we all set that kind of ambitious level and pursue it.
Thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes left, I'm sorry. So please keep your comments very, very short. Last comment, if possible. Last couple of comments.
So very quickly, and building on what Brad just said, one of the things that I think that we need to do now and make a high priority is to very clearly articulate and translate how our existing legal principles and obligations, how they apply to cyberspace. When we have certain kinds of attacks, how and what rules do those attacks violate? What is the level of due diligence on the part of governments and other actors? And to make it really clear, with cases that spell it out. You do this, this violates that rule. And that's something that is still missing in a lot of what we're talking. So to have that, make that translation effort exercise to really, so we understand clearly how the existing law that we have applies and when lines are crossed.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Léonard Roland, French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you for this fascinating discussion. I just wanted to give an EU perspective on two critical issues that were touched upon today. First, the security of products, because I think every discussion on cybersecurity should start here. Companies should only put on the market products that are secure by design and by default. Otherwise, it can easily be hacked. And that was one of the principles of the Paris Call. And it didn't stay as a principle of the Paris Call. It was then took over by the OECD, who produced, after the Paris Call, recommendations on this. And then the EU Commission inspired itself by this recommendation by the OECD to produce the first regulation ever on the security of products, which is the Cyber Resilience Act. So I think it's a good example of how the Paris Call led to a legally binding regulation, and we hope that in this domain of regulation, like in others, there will be a Brussels effect worldwide. The second issue is the crucial issue of cyber assistance. And here again, the EU is innovating right now with the new concept of the cyber reserve. What is a cyber reserve? It's a pool of trusted private companies doing incident response that could, with EU money, be deployed in member states who are victims of attacks. And President Macron, during the last summit of the European political community, proposed that all the beneficiaries of this cyber reserve should be expanded to all the countries of the European political community. So we're working on it right now, and I think it's a very promising work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones, just 1 second, and then I want to give the last word to Prime Minister Reimer. Please go ahead.
So just following up on Brad's point about what's happening, there's now an international counter-ransomware initiative that was started in the US. It's now got 50 countries and Interpol as part of that. It's looking at 3 main areas. Firstly, policy. Secondly, capacity diplomacy. And the third one is an international counter-ransomware task force. So that's 50 countries coming together behind a common threat and looking about what they can do in actual action around that, pursuing the criminals, pursuing the infrastructure, and actually making it safer for communities as well. So the last meeting was just last week in Washington, DC, and all the information is out there if people look at that as well. So there is some positive things going on, and again, being able to bring that to these sort of events is really, really important. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, Prime Minister.
No, I was trying to follow as much as I could, and I strongly believe that we are in a point in time when we have to deal with the bless and also to prepare for a curse. What is happening with the technology, and lately even with the AI, it's a big bless, I believe, for the humanity, and also, first and foremost, from my position point of view, for reforming in a way that was never possible to imagine the states and how the institutions relate with the people, with the public and private interests, and with also with needs more and more of everyone, every citizen, for transparency in the process of governance and for speed in the decision making. So, if we will be able to take this in the right way, it will be something of a magnitude that we may not be even able to imagine. But on the other hand, we have to prepare also to avoid that this becomes the curse of humanity. Because, you know, we have a say in Albanian, the angel and the devil live within the human. So the technology and the AI and everything, all these things are the angel and the devil together. So we have to see if we can separate them, but so far it has been too difficult to separate the angel and the devil within the human beings. And this is what I could say at the end, and thank you very much again for this opportunity.
Thank you. This is the end of our roundtable. We've heard a lot of very interesting comments, very encouraging comments also. I mean, lots of threats and risks, but also lots of good ideas. Very encouraging for our work at the Paris Peace Forum as well. We have our work cut out for us, I guess. Thank you for coming. Thank you for participating.